whole subject of what it means to be human. Actually, the first time a few years ago at Johns Hopkins, when they were doing this as a thematic study and had invited several people of different perspectives to present their answers on how they saw the response to the question, what does it mean to be human? And there were two Christians called on to address the issue, and Francis Collins and I were the ones who took the Judeo-Christian worldview to answer the question. But that was some years ago. And as I'm looking at the theme now, developing it in my own way for different audiences, this is really one of the most foundational questions in life for you and for me, because it is in effect a self-defining question in general terms that has particular and individual implications. Some of you may have heard me tell the story of what happened many, many years ago in the former Soviet Union in the year 2000, when they decided to empty their prisons and all of the political prisoners were being released. One of the men who was released had already been there for 55 years. He was about 20 when he had been incarcerated, and he was 75 now. He was a Hungarian by descent, and he had gotten into the war, had been captured, and was now kept under Soviet control, and for a lot of those years was in solitary confinement. They were actually going to execute him because they thought he had lost his mind and was speaking what they thought was total gibberish. But somebody suggested that they bring in a Hungarian psychiatrist to examine him, if indeed he was what they said, that he was insane. And the psychiatrist came and spent several hours with him, if not days, because the first time I told this story, I was in Washington, D.C., and a man from the audience walked up from Hungary. He said, "I know exactly who you're talking about." This story really hit the headlines back home. So Andrei Stamas was the prisoner, captured at the age of 20 and now being a pawn in discussion 55 years later. The psychiatrist said to the Soviet powers that be, "Release him to us, we will take care of him. He is not speaking gibberish, he's speaking an old Hungarian dialect. We will be happy to make him well, it'll take some time." And they finally signed the papers, and the medical practitioner put him on a wheelchair and was wheeling him out. As he was heading out, he asked and made his first request. Nobody was expecting what he was going to ask for. He asked for a mirror. He hadn't seen his face in 55 years. So age 20 when he was incarcerated, now 75, worn out, exhausted, bullied, almost dehumanized. When they gave him the mirror, the doctor said he looked at it for all of about a second or two, put it face down, and held his face in his hands and just sobbed uncontrollably. He had lost the image of who he was and how he even looked. If you have ever been to the concentration camps of Auschwitz or Buchenwald or Dachau or anywhere, and you see the pictures of the people as they were brought in, and then as some were executed, and even the children and so on, you see that sunken face look of just bones with skin pulled taut around that skeletal structure. They hardly know who they are. It is a deliberate effort to get them to undefine themselves. And as I read that story some time back, some years ago, I asked myself the question, how did their tormentors define what it meant to be human? They must have had a definition. They must have had a way of viewing their fellow human beings. Whatever the definition was, it was obvious that they were taking them from a pretty low rung of a ladder to bring them lower and lower and lower, till not only was the tormentor wrongly defining them, but the individuals had lost a definition for who they were and what they were intended to be. That's really what this story is all about. In fact, the entire Nazi attempt was to find the Superman, the superior human who could control the race and take the less capable and the less possible in them to be submerged and dominated by the superior. What does the Bible say about this? My talk to you tonight, my dear friend, is going to be on the Judeo-Christian view of what it means to be human. I will take the major address here, and after I finish, my colleague from Oxford University, who teaches at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford, Vince Vitale, a dear friend and a colleague, he and I had the privilege of authoring the last book together, What Does It Mean to Be, on Why Suffering, and now we are teaming up on this theme. I believe there are really 4 thoughts on how the Judeo-Christian worldview sees the essence and the existence of a human being, what we call Homo sapiens. The first is in the reality of creation, that we are not the random collocation of time plus matter plus chance. We are not an accidental blip on the radar screen of time, that there is a designer and a creator who has a specific purpose for who we are and why we are here. Now, the problem with even that first assertion is that across the decades, so many contrary views have come, so many debates have been held, so many perspectives and counter-perspectives, and oftentimes the debates are held on the processes through which we became what we are, rather than focusing on the first cause and the purpose and the essence of who we are. The truth of the matter is, you can take a diversity of Christian thinkers on this, and they will have a diversity of views on the issue of time, on the issue of process, in the issue of contingencies, and so on the age of the earth. All of these come in. When you get sidetracked into that, you forget the fundamental precept of what it is the intention was in God's mind, who we are and why we are here. And this is what I want to say to you. Even the noted philosopher Anthony Flew, who for most of his life was an avowed atheist and wrote so much against the existence of God, in the last few years of his life went onto the fork in the road because he believed his own critique of theism was not valid in his mind anymore, and he made a strong statement that the philosophical ramifications of our origin are crucial for the issue of morality and meaning. The philosophical ramifications of who we are defining for morality and meaning. How we go through our moral reasoning and how we attribute meaning and purpose to human life. You know, it's fascinating, even listening to the debate in the last one with one segment of the candidates. And one of them was asked why her position had changed on a certain issue. And it is interesting that she previously defined her position with the word sacred in there. That there was a sacredness to our lives. But when the definitions changed, the word sacred was left out. And the entailments of removing sacred are enormous. You desacralize life, you desacralize relationships, you desacralize all of your work in life, and suddenly what is the opposite of sacred? Profane. Profanum comes from the Greek, where you literally lock God and the temple, as it were, outside of your life. The desacralization of life has ramifications, which G.K. Chesterton said so well. He said the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. That person may end up believing in anything. He went on to say there's only one angle at which you can stand straight and many angles at which you can fall. And so whatever your view, we must realize we are here to think of the philosophical extensions and the ramifications of how we define who we are. Now, the fact that the Judeo-Christian worldview sees a creator, without getting into the particulars of the how, two necessary entailments follow, or implications. Number one, there is intrinsic worth to every life. That worth is not given by government. That worth is not given by some statute. That worth is not given by a community or a society. That worth is intrinsically and essentially yours by virtue of being a person created by a designing and a worthy God. When Joseph Stalin was tormenting his people and killing them by the millions, he was not a very tall man. Stalin was not his real name. It was a nickname that was given to him of the steely countenance. It is fascinating when he began to torture his own people. I told this story to the faculty at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy, and there was pin drop silence. Here's the story. A Western diplomat went to see Mr. Stalin and asked him how he planned to have his people continue to follow him when he was torturing them like this. Stalin never gave this diplomat a verbal answer. He called a waiter and asked the waiter to bring him a live chicken. He took the live chicken and put that chicken under his arms and started to defeather that bird till it was completely denuded. The chicken by this point was quivering and trembling in his hands. He took the chicken and put it down, picked up a piece of bread and walked away from that chicken as the chicken was quivering there on the ground. And the chicken hobbled over towards Joseph Stalin, nuzzled between his trouser legs for warmth. Stalin bent down with a piece of bread and the chicken started to peck away at that bread. And Stalin looked at his visitor and said, "Do you have your answer?" "I tortured that chicken. It will follow me for food the rest of its life." He said, "People are like that. You torture them and they will follow you for food the rest of their lives." Very few journalists and diplomats had the courage to call him for who he was. Malcolm Muggeridge did in his book Winter in Moscow. And when he came back, he had changed his complete position on what a government like that was, which treated its people in such a demeaning way. That's precisely how he had started to define them. People were a means to his end. His ends were a clenched fist, which was the last gesture before he died, a fist towards the heavens. Young people, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at God's word, Moses gave his people 613 laws. David reduced them to 15. Isaiah reduced them to 11. Micah reduced them to 3. To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. So Micah took 613 laws and brought it down to 3. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. When Jesus was asked by an antagonist what the greatest commandment was, it is amazing to me that he did not reduce it to 1. It's profoundly moving to me that he did not reduce it to 1. He could have, but he reduced it to 2. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these 2 hang all of the laws and all of the prophets. 613 laws were put on 2 pegs. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Why did he give us 2 and not 1? Because of the first, the second necessarily follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. You don't have the essence of what the created order is then loving your neighbor becomes purely an option for you and for me. Jesus said it is not an option, it is a necessary corollary. It follows from the first. You see, your ethnicity, your race, who you are, is your distinctive gift by God. It is an inviolable gift that God has given to you. When he talks of all of the nations, when Paul gives his sermon there in the book of Acts, he talks of all of the nations that were there and how God had called him to take that message to every nation and every tongue and every tribe. You are a creature created by God, and there's a segue I want to give to you here before moving to the second ramification. I want you to follow me carefully now. Not only are you of essential worth with humanity, in that essentiality, there's a particular worth to you. I want you to follow this very carefully so we don't get lost in this whole thing that we call the mass of humanity. There is an individuality to you. In fact, it comes from the Latin indivisible. You cannot be broken up. You come as a unique composite. You are irreplaceable. A position can be refilled, but you will never replace a person. There's a uniqueness to them. My son, who's here in the audience, went to Taylor University, and in 2006, Taylor University had a terrible tragedy take place. On a weekend, some of the students were coming back from a weekend, I don't know where they had gone for some work over the weekend or what, and they were driving back in a van, and if I remember the story, at least parts of it correctly, I think it was a truck that crossed over the median and slammed into them, and most of them in that van were smashed to death. They were killed. One of the students survived. All the parents were informed. They came and picked up the corpses of their loved ones, and funerals were held. But the Van Ryn family was told that their daughter Laura was still alive, albeit hanging on by a thread. So the Van Ryn family hung around the bed day after day, week after week, and I think it was her boyfriend who was also present. And as she was beginning to regain consciousness, he started to ask her questions, but none of the questions they asked her were making any sense within the context of the Van Ryn family. And I think it was a boyfriend who one day said, you know, there's something wrong here. Either she's completely out of it, or I don't think this is Laura. And the parents were upset, saying, what are you talking about? The brain is damaged, she's been hit hard, give her some time. He said, no, something is wrong. And one day this gal looking up with her matted blonde hair and all says, I don't understand why you keep calling me Laura. I am not Laura. My name is Whitney. I'm Whitney. There's silence in the room, and they contact the authorities in the university, saying, was there a Whitney in this van? I said, yeah, but she's been buried. I said, no, you better come on over here. So they talked to her, and they bring in the coroner and asked him if he'd done a DNA test on the burials. Said no. Said, do you know who this is? And they did a DNA test and found out she was indeed Whitney Serac. She was not Laura Van Ryn. But there was already a grave marker with Whitney's name on it, although she was here, very much alive. And all of a sudden the Seracs are contacted and told, your daughter is alive. And the Van Ryns had to pack their bags and go back and go to the grave and realize that their daughter was actually buried there, and the change of the name had to take place on the marker. Every life in that van was valuable. But there were relationships and a particularity. That's why we are given names, not to confer individuality, but to recognize the individuality that is already there. So in creation, we have the ramifications of intrinsic worth. We also have, number two, a reflective splendor. There is a splendor that we are called upon to reflect, and that splendor is ultimately to the glory of God. That's what sacredness really means, set apart. We are set apart for the glory of God. After the war, when the Japanese Prime Minister Konoye thought of all the horrors that had transpired and all that had been engineered and all of the schemes that were lost, he was alone in a room and took his own life. When they saw the last page that he had open, he underlined these words: "As terrible as it was what the world did to me, nothing was as terrible as what I did to myself." Nothing was as terrible as what I did to myself. As I speak to you, there's a great tragedy taking place in Vegas. A renowned basketball player, Lamar Odom, I think is his name, about 7 feet tall or something, big strapping figure, wanted to get away from it all. What did he do? He spent his time in a brothel, drugged his body with cocaine and other stuff to give him some excitement for those few days, till a 911 call came and described what was coming out of his nose and what was coming out of his mouth, and he was totally unconscious. And I think some news wires are saying that he's gone, other news wires are saying that he's unconscious in extremely critical condition. And I don't know the man, I don't even remember watching him play, but here's what I want to say to you. What a way to bid goodbye to the world when you're blessed with such physique and such genius in a capacity that very few human beings would ever have. He was looking for a thrill, looking for something to bring him out of his doldrums and into some sense of excitement. And he's bid goodbye to this world. And he may as well underline also the words of Oscar Wilde: "As terrible as it was what the world did to me, nothing was as terrible as what I did to myself." And so to you young men and women, if there's a challenge I want to give to you, there's a reflective splendor to which God calls you. Don't let anybody rob you of that when He reminds you that He has made you for Himself, and your heart is restless until you have your rest in Him. The creation factor talks to me of intrinsic worth and a reflective splendor. The incarnation actually reminds me that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. In the person of Jesus Christ, we see the unfolding of the gospel story. No matter what your faith or your belief may be, it is a fact said by hundreds and hundreds of people, even by skeptics, that when you see the person and the life of Jesus Christ, virtually unparalleled. When I was writing my book, An Imaginary Conversation Between Jesus and Buddha, I entitled it The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Talks to Buddha. I interviewed so many Buddhist monks, priests, and scholars in Thailand and Malaysia and all of that. And oftentimes at the end of the day, I would sit down with them and talk to them. And the conversation would move to the person of Jesus Christ and my faith. On more than a half a dozen occasions, a monk or a priest or a scholar would say, "You know what? In Jesus Christ, we see somebody so unique and so unmatched." And there would be a recognition and a respect for who He not only claimed to be, but how He lived. In the person of Jesus Christ and His incarnation, I see two implications. Number one is the absoluteness of the moral law, that this is a moral universe. We have to think in terms of moral reasoning. And what we are watching happen in our political landscape in America is a destructive process right now. And why is it destructive? Because we only think of right and left. We have forgotten there's an up and a down. When you lose the up and the down, you will only have the right and the left, and you will have swords drawn against each other. Do you know, in the House of Commons in London, the two parties are actually separated by a measured distance. It was so that if you spat, you couldn't spit across on the other person. And I think it has something to do with certain sword lengths as well. Imagine leading a country but keeping you from spitting against each other. Last year I had the privilege of being in Brazil along with some friends here to see the World Cup in soccer. Now I've seen cricket. It's a gentleman's game. That's why you hear somebody, when someone else is cheating, you say, that's not cricket. Soccer, you can bite off another person's ear, you can do whatever you want and be sent home, you know. And the 100 people who had the closest seats to the game, 3 feet away from the rim of the field, did not get to see the game or any match. They had to turn their backs to the play because they were watching all of the rabble-rousers up in the stands in case anybody came with knife and other weapon in hand to kill the player he didn't think performed to his liking. And the players, they themselves had men in uniform watching their behavior. I was doing a program for the BBC and mentioned this. Players had referees and umpires watching to make sure nobody chewed off another person's ear. Outside the rim was standing 100 fellows looking at us so that they made sure we didn't do anything naughty. And you know what the BBC guy said to me? I'm not sure you really want to use this illustration in England because soccer is a very sacred thing out here, you know. Fascinating. What do we see? Laws are broken again and again and again. Rules are broken again and again and again. And that's why we need thousands of pages for health insurance laws, because every sentence dies the death of 1,000 qualifications. It's not enough to use one word on a plane about the smoke detector. They say don't touch, tamper, disable, or destroy. You know? Why can't you just say don't mess with this? Because somebody can say I didn't mess with it, it just messed itself, you know. My father-in-law was a chemical engineer with Shell Oil. He had a brother who had a way with words. And his brother, in the younger days, they had these gramophone machines and gramophone records made out of plastic or whatever. And inadvertently, his brother Arnold sat on a chair with about 12 of his father's favorite records on the chair and crashed. The whole thing was smashed. It broke. And Arnold didn't know what to do. His father was really going to have his hide when he got back. So the father came back, and he walked into the living room and saw the shattered pieces of all of those favorite LPs, as they call them, long playings, the records. And he called the boys down and said, what happened here? And Arnold looked and said, Dad, it got sat upon. It got sat upon. So what you're really saying is, it's its fault. If it weren't there, it would not be the way it is right now. I have a friend in Australia who was attending a weekend of a social, and his wife made 2 beautiful cream pies. He told me this story himself. He said, and he was bringing it down the stairs, one in each hand. She'd spent all, you can see what's coming, you know. And he stumbled and slipped, and the pies, Murphy's Law, face down. And he looked at it and he said, called his wife. He said, why didn't you cover it? Why did you give it to me like this? And she just stood there staring at him. He said, then I burst out crying, thinking, what a fool I am, you know. There is a moral law. And here's what I want to say to you. Somebody was asking a question, and a good question yesterday at Carnegie Mellon. And he raised the question that, yeah, religion has oppressed people, atheists have oppressed people, you know, haven't they both in power done the wrong things? Yes, but there is a difference. When a man who claims to be a Christian oppresses people and hurts them and bullies them and victimizes them, he or she is violating the rules by which the Christian is called to live, violating the message. But if an atheist does what Mao Zedong did, what Stalin did, they could legitimately consider it a natural outworking of their atheistic worldview. One can be logically deduced for their own purposes. One is an illogical, and that is the difference. Kai Nielsen, the atheist from Calgary, says this: "We have not been able to show that reason requires us to have a moral point of view, or that really rational persons unhoodwinked by myth or ideology need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't really decide here. I know the picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not lead you to morality. There is no rationally compelling reason why you should be moral. You may choose to be, and many of them are. There's no rationally compelling reason for it, because morality is ultimately self-referencing. And so I say to you, in the whole reality of incarnation, we get the absoluteness of the moral law, and the second ramification is we have the supremacy of love. We have the supremacy of love. This thing for which we yearn. Again, someone last night asked the question of love, and I talked of the words from the Greek: agape, phileo, storge, eros, God's love, friendship love, protective love, romantic love, all hang on the peg of God's love. My love and how I express my love cannot be self-defined. It is defined by God, and an intrinsic part of God's definition for love is commitment. Commitment is an inextricable part of love. You know, I was talking to a person a few weeks ago, came to visit me. I won't say too much. These things are live streamed and I want to protect people. And whatever the situation was, she'd wanted out. She'd wanted out from her family. And I said to her, "You're counting the cost, are you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Reason?" She said, "I have no reason, I just want out." I said, "Did you ever love this individual?" "Oh yeah, oh yeah." I said, "But now?" She said, "Oh no." And the conversation went. And I said, "How do you know that you will not get into another relationship and again claim love now, and 3 years from now claim it's not there?" I said, "You better think very carefully about what love really means. You have to have that sense of commitment." In the old English language, the commitment was made in these words: "With my body I thee worship." There was an exclusivity made in love, an exclusivity, so that when you said, "Yes, I do" to one, you were really saying, "No, I don't" to every other. There is a sacredness that is given to love. But you know, I want you to follow this now. Yeah, it's easier to talk about something like that, isn't it, as adults and all of that. I'm now a grandfather, and I watch the grandkids in a very different way than I watched my own. And my daughter one day said to me, "Dad, why?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe you have a certain stock of affection and love, and when you have your own, 90% of them is exhausted in worry and care and bathing and providing this and that. You've only got about 10% left to feel. And when you have the grandkids, the parents do the 90% of the care. Now we've got 90% of the feel and only 10% of the work. So that whenever our grandkids come and visit us, we have a ball, but when they go, my wife and I sit down on a chair and stare at each other for about 2 minutes saying, "What just happened?" You know? Let me tell you about our leader. Winston Churchill was once asked by a corporal, "Have I ever told you about my grandchildren?" Churchill said, "No, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it." Since I'm not Churchill, let me tell you a couple of stories. Our oldest grandson is a fellow by the name of Jude. He has a vocabulary and a half. I don't know where he picks up his vocabulary from, but I'll tell you, he sure can use it. Big, big words. And he's now 4, but when he was about 3 1/4 or something like that, or 3 1/2, everybody were praying around the table for the food. And then he looks at his father and says, "Mommy prayed. Why did you say amen?" So, sorry, it was the other way around. He looked at his mom and said, "Daddy prayed. Why did you say amen?" So she, being the daughter of an apologist, gave too long an answer. She was going on and on and on, and he was just staring at her and finally threw his arms up in the air and he went like this, "Will somebody please explain to me what on earth has just happened here?" 3 1/2. Not long after that, his mom had lost her car keys looking around the house. She couldn't find it. She just paused for a moment, slapped her forehead and said, "I must be losing my mind." He walked up to her and he said, "Mommy, whatever you do, don't lose your heart because I'm in there." 3 1/2. 3 1/2. How is it possible for us in our world to hurt such little ones? When they've understood belongingness is a vital part of reality. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to say to you, in the Christian worldview, you belong to God first. He pours that love into your relationships. Belongingness is the fountain from which all of your other relationships flow. This is very unique and very distinctive to the Judeo-Christian worldview. So you've got creation, you've got incarnation, thirdly and quickly you've got the transformation. God promises to change your heart. No other worldview does. Every other worldview asks you to change your own heart and earn the right to enter into His presence. That's a reality. That's what we are told, to lift ourselves up by our own moral bootstraps. But the story that God gives to us is that He brings a change in your heart and in mine. I'm 69 years old today, or this year. Not today. Although if you want to give me a gift, it'll be fine, you know. No, just kidding. 69 years old this year. It was at the age of 17. From a life of meaninglessness, when I turned my life over to Jesus Christ. I never dreamed what He was going to do with me, in me, through me, for me. Yes, there have been valleys. Yes, there have been shadows. Yes, there have been long tunnels. But there's never been a moment but that I have known He brought my feet onto solid ground. And because of Him, I have a light into the future. Because of Him, I have an arm around my life as He carries me through. It's that transformation of my heart that ultimately, as it happened in my heart and our brothers and sisters, actually my sister was the first to lead me into a knowledge of these kinds of things, that my father's heart was ultimately changed. And if you'd known my dad and the nasty temper with which he lived, when my dad's life was transformed, it was so dramatic that people who knew him marveled at what had happened in change. About 5 or 6 days from now, I'm going to be in Louisiana and Baton Rouge. I will be speaking at the Angola prison. I was telling some friends before the meeting here, Angola prison was the bloodiest prison in America. Over 5,000 prisoners in Angola prison, 85% of them on life without parole. The chaplain was telling me when you had come into that prison, there was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood on the ceilings. When a prisoner was checked in, he was given a knife to defend himself. It's an all-male prison. 45 on death row. And as I walked past death row and shook hands with them, prayed with them, talked to them, and then spoke to a group of about 80 or 90 of them who have joined a seminary distance learning program. You see, some years ago, a warden by the name of Burl Cain said, I'll take over this prison, I'll direct it if you allow me to do it my way. He put a Bible in every cell. He held chapel every day. He brought a seminary into the program. And now it has become one of the safest prisons in America. And I was told by the chaplains, you could bring the prettiest young woman and walk her past these cells. You won't hear a wolf call or a whistle or a nasty comment. Profanity is not allowed in this prison by either the inmates or the staff. When some of my buddies are going to join me next week. I just got a confirmation from the governor's office today that we are doing this next week. And I'll tell you what, when you walk away from that chapel service and see the prisoners, in fact, the letter that came to me today said, would you like to have lunch with the chaplains and the team, or would you rather have lunch with the prisoners? I said, with the prisoners, don't even let me think about it. Because I've had a meal with them before when they have served it to me. You talk about faith. They serve you that. They lead in the worship service when they're doing their Bible studies, arms, muscles bulging like watermelons out there. And one of the chaplains said to me, the gang of thugs in this prison has now become a gang of pastors. And one of them said to me when I asked him if he was there on life without parole, he said yes. I said, how does it feel to know you're never going to walk out of here? He said, Mr. Zacharias, if you knew what I'd done and why I'm here, I was really a prisoner outside. He said, I have come here now and I found Jesus Christ for the first time in my life. I'm free. He said, pray for my parents. They're outside and they think they're free. They're in chains. Creation, incarnation, transformation, and lastly, consummation. God gives us a hope. God gives us a promise. God gives us the reality that time is not the end, that there is an eternity. That there is an eternity. When Jesus promised his disciples that he would rise again, he promised he would rise again bodily to give them the empirical proof of the bodily resurrection that he was who he exactly claimed to be, and gave hope and promise to a whole generation then and to life beyond that. Billy Graham once told us, sitting around a luncheon table, that he was speaking once in a one-on-one conversation with Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of Germany, and Adenauer broke the conversation dramatically and walked up to the window, looked out at the ruins of his city, and turned to Billy Graham and he said to him, Mr. Graham, do you believe that Jesus Christ really rose again from the dead? Billy Graham said, I looked at him and said, Mr. Chancellor, if I did not believe that, I would have no message to give to this world. It's the resurrection of Jesus that keeps me going. I was with the Graham team people last weekend, and Billy Graham's latest book has just been released. It's called Where I Am, and it is taken from John 14. I go to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you may be also. I go to prepare a place for you. The hope that God gives to you and to me by the resurrection from the dead. And so I close with a simple illustration, and then I'll call my buddy to come and speak to you, Vince. The college football coach Lou Little tells a story in his memoirs about a young student who was always very obedient, very good, very well behaved, but was not a first stringer, so he never played much. He was just there as a backup. But he would notice this young man showing the facilities to his father whenever his father visited, till one day the father had passed away and the message came to the son in the university. And so he went to the coach, Lou Little, and said, do you mind if I'm not there this weekend, sir? I've got to attend my father's funeral. He said, no, you can go. So he went, buried his dad, and came back. And the following weekend, he looked at the coach and he said, do you mind if I play this game? He said, you're not number one. We have a better quarterback. He said, I understand. Let me play. If I'm not the best player on the field, you can sit me down. Coach Lou said he'd give him a chance or two. He was red hot, played a brilliant game, the best game he'd ever played, and was kept through the game. After it was over, the coach put his arm around him and he said, "You know, I used to watch you walk around with your dad, showing him all of the places from a distance. I never wanted to intrude. But now that he's passed away, you did this for him, didn't you?" He said, "Actually, Coach, it's more than that. My dad was blind. And this was the first time he was ever going to watch me play. And I was playing this for him." When you have the eternal perspective, it redefines everything for you. So you've got from the created order to the incarnation to transformation to consummation. That's what it means to be human in the Judeo-Christian worldview. God bless you. Thank you so much. Come on up, friends.